Hey guys, welcome back. Today is the day that I finally conclude the AcroBee build. In this video, I'm going to go over my final thoughts on Newbie Drone's AcroBee Kit. This one in particular has the unicorn motors. I previously did 3 other videos that go over the hardware, the assembly, and also the installation of the software and configuring Betaflight. And I think it's finally time that I get this thing wrapped up. Before I get into it and yak your ear off about this thing, since you guys have been so patient, let's go straight to some flight footage. Check this out. Flies pretty nice, right? If you're still here, let's go over the features in the AcroBee that I am a fan of, and afterwards I'm going to bring up everything where I think there's room for improvement. So let's shoot over to the overhead camera and take a closer look at this guy. Positives with this kit is it's incredibly easy to put together and requires absolutely no soldering. Everything just simply falls into place. The only real tool that you're going to need is a small eyeglass style screwdriver in order to put the screws in to retain the flight controller and the camera itself. Those are readily available, and many times when you buy other kits that might come with small screws, you're going to get the screwdriver that will work for you. But even still, if you don't, they're only a couple of bucks at a hardware store, and that's not really a big hurdle to get that little baby screwdriver in order to work with these screws. Other positives is they provide a pre-configured version of Betaflight for this flight controller. That's really nice. It really doesn't require much setup at all. Just simply flash the board using standard practices like you would flash any other board. You don't even need to define your inputs on your transmitter because depending on the version that you got, they're already going to do that for you. And with the FR Sky version, everything was defined properly, and I didn't even need to change that. One thing that I did notice in the firmware is that the D gains were set a little on the high side, higher than I would definitely normally set them. And we'll talk about that a little more when I bring up the screen capture of Betaflight and we go through some of the pre-configured items, and I'm also going to show you some of the things in there that I changed to meet my personal needs. Overall, I'm definitely happy with this kit. I'm incredibly impressed with the way it flies. I was very skeptical going into it for a lot of different reasons. But truthfully, I'm glad I was able to get this kit from Newbie Drone. It definitely changed my mind about this particular aircraft. To mention again, this version does have the unicorn motors, and they have a tremendous amount of power for a 6mm motor. They do get a little warm, and they're not the most efficient motors in the world, but they feel really good when you're flying them, and I definitely enjoy the experience of the Tiny Whoop or the AcroBee or any small aircraft like this with the unicorn motors in them. They rev very quickly, and there's not a lot of throttle lag like some other high kV motors, and they just make for a really good experience. I would say the flight experience with the unicorn motors is actually similar to a larger quad. I mean, not quite the punch of a 5-inch quad, you know, or anything of that class, but they really do liven this guy up a lot. In some of my previous builds, I have been a big fan of the 7mm motors. I would say overall, the unicorn motors would probably win in a drag race, but the 7mm motors have more torque and they're more efficient. I kind of don't know what I like better, because having the additional torque can spin the prop up faster, but it doesn't necessarily have the high speed that the unicorn motors are capable of, even though it might take a little bit longer to get these motors to spin up. And I think it's a great idea to use the 3-blade props in this scenario with these motors to help make these higher kV unicorn motors a little bit more efficient. On average, I'm getting about 2 minutes of flight time with the unicorn motors versus about 3.5 minutes of flight time with a 7mm motor. One other feature of the AcroBee kit that I think is definitely worth mentioning is you control the VTX and your channels through the Betaflight OSD. This is one of the first microquads that I've seen with that feature, and I guess there's another company doing it now as well. That's just really nice for configuring your VTX and changing your channel. It makes it super easy. You don't have to worry about button pushes or reading crazy LED configurations that nobody understands without a manual. I would say that's probably one of the best features of the AcroBee, other than the fact that it is a nice, well thought out kit and everything goes together really well, and it does fly excellent as well. I have no complaints about the flight performance at all with this. Now getting into what I don't like. One of the first things that I noticed was the RX antenna. And I don't know if you can see it in here or not, because the color is very similar to the flight controller itself. This is one of the thinnest wires I've ever seen used on one of these micro class flight controllers. I do have concerns about it breaking, so I did sandwich it in between the VTX board and the flight controller. However, that's affecting the range, and I can't really go too far with it configured like this. Down the road, I think I'm going to replace this with a piece of magnet wire so I can stand it up and hopefully get a little bit better range. The next thing I don't really care for is the configuration of the antenna on the VTX. And if you look here, I've actually changed my setup a little bit. Problem number one is using these tiny little UFL connectors in order to attach the antenna. These come apart relatively easily, and even though there's like a silicone glue on here to try to hold it together, this can be an issue if you have to replace it. These connectors wear out, so after, you know, a few crashes, you may not be able to get the antenna to stay on here at all anymore. And it kind of moves around a little bit if you use the default setup in order to position the antenna. There's a clip right here on the top of the camera mount where it's designed to clip the antenna itself in. And I don't like this either, and that's actually why I've laid my antenna down in a little bit more of a mullet mod. When you stand up an antenna, you're gonna break it. This is something that we learned last year when these mullet mods started gaining in popularity. And I don't understand why Well, a lot of manufacturers of these micro aircraft aren't taking that into consideration when they're designing the cameras and the VTXs and that particular layout. If you lay the antenna down, you're probably not going to break it in a crash. When you stand it upright, well, what's going to happen when you crash? And I mean, come on, you don't crash right side up. You know, you're going to be flipping around and you're going to be upside down. I would imagine it would be very easy to break the antenna, maybe even the cable itself, having this point fixing it here in the camera mount. What I did to get past that, and I hope you guys can see this on camera, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, hopefully to make this a little more obvious as to what I did, is I took just a small piece of clear heat shrink and I poked a hole in it and I wrapped it around the antenna and I screwed it into the back side of the frame where the flight controller attaches. This holds it very firmly in place. As you can see, when I move the antenna itself, it does not move the wire from the mounting point down anywhere in between here or up to the connector. So if I move this around, this hopefully isn't going to go anywhere, and it's going to help me, or it's going to help prevent the antenna from getting damaged. Another thing that I did is I put a little additional heat shrink on the end of the antenna itself to protect that tiny end, the actual, you know, exposed antenna portion after the dipole. I just thought it'd be a good idea to protect that with a little bit of heat shrink, and I haven't had any issues with this setup whatsoever. Performs just like any other camera VTX combo that I've used that's set up like a mullet mod. I do wish they gave you a solder point on here though, so you could swap out the antenna. Some people like using the cloverleaf antennas because you do get a little bit better performance. But whatever, it is what it is. This is what they gave us, and this is my solution to try and help prevent the antenna from getting damaged in a crash. The next item that is kind of a positive is it comes pre-installed with this 2mm connector for your standard, you know, PW style batteries. This connector is much more robust than the 1.25mm connector that comes on the standard Inductrix boards. But I kind of have a complaint about the one that is attached to the AcroBee board, or the BeeBrain V2 flight controller. For some reason, I'm not getting a very good connection with this connector in my batteries. It just feels loose. Newbie Drone did include an additional connector, and I think down the road I'm going to try to swap that out to see if it works better. I do not have that connection problem with any other of my whoops, so I really can't blame anything else other than the connector that came pre-installed on here. Otherwise, it looks like it's good quality. I don't know if maybe the other connectors I have stretched out the pins and the batteries themselves a little bit, but just overall, I'm going to have to swap this out because it is affecting performance, and it is also affecting flight time with my batteries. And that's going to have to get done eventually at some point. And the last issue that I've had that is definitely worth mentioning, there's been several times where I've plugged a battery in that I've gotten absolutely no output from the VTX. It is just simply nothing but snow. And it's not difficult to correct the issue. I've just unplugged the battery and I've plugged it back in. I don't think that should be an issue in the first place. Maybe I got a VTX that's a little moody. I don't know, but this is what it is in my case. I'd say it's happened to me maybe about 8 times, and I've definitely flown at least a couple hundred batteries through this thing, so the percentage isn't very high, but it is kind of annoying when you have everything all set up and you go to put your goggles on and you're ready to go and you want to take off and you have nothing but snow. You gotta take your goggles off, put your transmitter aside, unplug the battery, plug it back in, and in every situation it's been fine and it's been good to go. I have not had the video cut out while flying, only while initially connecting the battery. So there's a few things that I've noticed after living with the AcroBee for a few weeks. Overall, I'm very happy with it as a kit. Newbie Drone has made me a believer in this setup, and I have enjoyed flying it. I think now it's time to get into beta flight, and we'll go over some of the settings in there. I have, a few recommendations, things that I would change from stock, and I'm also going to have a full and differential dump. I'll have links to those in the description, so if you guys have any problems or questions when you're setting up your AcroBee, you can refer to my configuration, and hopefully that'll help you out. Okay, so I'm going to plug this in the computer, and then we're going to shoot over to the screen capture, and I'm going to click away on some things, and you guys can get a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and click on the connect button. There really isn't a lot to change in here after you flash the updated firmware. In some cases, there may be no reason to update the firmware, but I'm just going to click through the different options here, and we're going to take a look real quick as to the way this is set up. On the ports tab, there's no reason to change anything here. Just run it how it is. Under configuration, again, there's really not a lot to change here. However, by default, it's going to come with an 8K 8K PID loop. I changed it to 8K 4K to free up a little bit more overhead with the processor, and I'm going to show you why. I am actually running the dynamic filtering, and once I enabled this, my processor load was a little bit higher than I was comfortable with, and I just simply bumped down my loop to 4K here, and that corrected the issue with the processor wasn't overloaded, but it was just at rest. It was a little higher than I was comfortable with, and when you run the dynamic filter, that is really going to change the load that's on the CPU, and I always try to keep it below 30%. I think that's a good place to have it. That's really it here on the configuration. Oh, and what also is worth mentioning is if you're not an Acro pilot, you probably don't want to run dynamic filter. If you're using the accelerometer by enabling the dynamic filter, you can overload the CPU, which can create crazy oscillations when you're trying to fly, and they can actually be intermittent depending on how much load the dynamic filter is putting on the CPU. Keep that in mind because all of my dumps are set up for an Acro pilot. If that's not you and you like to fly in angle or horizon mode, shoot me a message or leave me a comment and I'll help you get your setup figured out to what's going to be best for you. Really, we've got the PIDs tabs. To start on the right hand side, your rates. This is all personal preference. I do like to add a little bit of expo on my whoops. It makes them a little bit more controllable, especially because I try to keep my rates close to, well, where all my other quads are configured, just to give everything a consistent feel. Normally I would do about 1200 degrees, 800 degrees. In this case, I just went with 1200 and 700. It just feels good here, but this is personal preference. You set your rates wherever you like them. On the PID side, by default, everything here is pretty darn high. Right now I'm on profile 3. So let's just shoot over to 1 and we'll look at the defaults real quick. And you can see that our roll, pitch, and yaw are pre-configured at 86, 90, and 123. And over here, our Ds are kind of high. This is higher than I would normally recommend running, especially if you have unicorn motors. But let's go back to the profile I'm currently running, and we'll take a look at how I have that set up. So you can see I did raise my eye gains quite a little bit on some of these. It's really helped tighten the AcroBee up, and it feels really nice with these numbers. If you like a nice, tight flying aircraft, I would recommend trying these here. But something else to keep in mind is because I'm flying Acro, I'm also running the PT1 filters. You may not be able to get away with your P term set that high if you're still running biquad. And again, I don't really recommend making this change if you're not flying an Acro. In conjunction with that, I've also disabled the first 2 gyro notch filters. I don't typically disable the D term, especially on these small aircraft. This is how you can smoke motors really quickly, and I kind of like to play it on the safe side, and I pretty much leave this enabled on everything that I fly. But to get back to my PIDs, you'll see here on my D terms, because I am flying both PT1 and with dynamic filters, I have significantly lowered my D-gains, and this has helped prevent the unicorn motors from getting so hot. Anybody that's flying the unicorns, if you're having a heat issue with those, the first thing I would recommend is getting right in here to your PIDs and turning down your D-gains to like 18 or 20. That's a pretty good spot to have them, I found. We're still going to actually get benefit from the setting, but it's not going to be too much as to where you're damaging your motors. Always keep in mind that too high of a D-gain can smoke your motors, and I have done that with NBD Golds. So yeah, whenever I'm running PT1 and dynamic filter, I always keep these low, about 20 or lower. Don't go anything above that. Even the default setting at like 30 and 35 is too high for these, and you'll smoke them with PT1 if you have that enabled. You'll probably get like 2 or 3 batteries through them, but that's really going to be about it. For some reason, I don't have my anti-gravity gain set very high in this. I usually set this at about 10 for these little guys. Let's do that now. I don't know why I didn't. Okay, so that's fixed. And in a nutshell, this is where I have all my PIDs set. But check my dumps, especially the differential dump, because it'll be an easy place for you guys to find these settings. On the receiver tab, you really don't have to change anything here. It does have an RSSI channel defined. I didn't have time to really experiment with this, so I can't tell you how well it works or not, but it is here. Maybe down the road I'll do something with that. On your modes, this is all personal preference. I've set this up the way I set up all my micro aircraft. On the OSD, this is all personal preference. Set it up how you like it. I like to have mine simple. All I really have here is flight mode, throttle position, battery voltage, and my fly minutes. This is all I really need. That, in a nutshell, is what I like and what I don't like about Newbie Drone's AcroBee Kit. Overall, this is a great aircraft for the money. It's excellent for a beginner that wants to get into the whoop game and doesn't have a lot of experience with soldering or assembling quads. If you haven't done so, please check out the first 3 videos in this series where I get into much more detail on this build. I'm going to have links for those videos in the description. Also, I have a playlist for the AcroBee build specifically. If you can, do me a favor, shoot over to HotDogFPV.com and check out what they have over there. They have some really nice straps for your goggles, for your transmitters. They also have a line of really nice apparel that is all FPV related. And maybe you can show some support and pick up a t-shirt or a hoodie that says Derek and his drone on it. Those are my personal favorite, but I'm not biased or anything. I'm also on Instagram. You can check me out there, Derek and his drone. Please be sure to like this video, leave me a comment, but if you do anything, click on that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything to get this content, and that really helps me out, and I super appreciate it. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.